Well, hi, everyone. Tonight we're starting off our Kabbalat Shabbat with a learner's Minyan. So a little 20 to 25 minute mini lesson on one of the liturgical elements of our service, so that when you come to services here at Temple Israel, you know a little bit more about the prayers that you're saying, or especially nowadays, when you're at home and you're saying prayers either with us or on your own, you have a little bit more of a grasp as to perhaps the history and the meaning of that prayer. So tonight I thought, this month, because we do it once a month, I thought we'd tackle one of my favorite prayers, one that is really important to, I think, today's world, and that's the Hashkivenu. The prayer is the one that we do on Friday nights after Michamocha, and the prayer, so that you have it in front of you while we're talking about it, for those in our Mishkan Tefillah, is on page 160. And for those who are using our Travelers, 160. And for those who are using our Travelers Mishkan Tefillah, it's on page 38. And it has the Hashkivenu, Adonai Eloheinu, the Shalom. We usually sing the first few lines, or we sing another version, which is the Chatima at the end. The Chaparei Sukkot Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'al Yerushalayim. So, typically what we do, and we do, especially like tonight, we'll do the Matovu version. Sometimes we do the Greg Talman version, and sometimes we do the Chatima. But all of it envelops the same idea of this prayer. So let's talk about the words of the prayer itself and their origins. So if you look at the prayer, grant us, O God, that we lie down in peace, right? Lay us down, right? This paragraph here that you're reading comes as an addition sort of to the previous one. Remember, the previous one we did right before this prayer was Michamocha. Michamocha is all about redemption. So it emphasizes that the redemption that we are seeking, right? Go through Michamocha and we come to Hashkivenu. The redemption that we're seeking is peaceful. It's bloodless. It's not through war. It's not a result of war, but instead of God's watchfulness, God's guardianship. And the way that the poetry of this liturgy is set up is very much like biblical parallelism. So verses 1 and 2, the grant, O God, that we lie down in peace and raise us up, O guardian, to a life renewed. That's a synonymous style. Verse 2 echoes and strengthens verse 1. We see this a lot in biblical poetry. They're syntactically parallel in Hebrew, both opening with an imperative. And verse 2, comes from, there's things that come from Psalm 106, right? Spread over us the shelter of your peace, guide us with your good counsel, for your name's sake, be our help. That's very much like Psalm 106:8. Yet God save them as befits God's name. So a lot of this does come from the Psalms there. If you read down in the English translation of the Hashkivenu, you'll come up to some words which maybe you haven't really noticed because we don't really sing them, right? After all this good stuff about shielding us and sheltering us, it says, defend us against enemies, illness, war, famine, and sorrow. Those are some very explicit words for our liturgy. Maybe we haven't noticed them before, but that is a very, very strong thing to say. These afflictions, each one, meaning, and our enemies, our illnesses, war, famine, and sorrow, are all mentioned in the Bible. You know, sorrow, it could also be troubles, right? That instance appears from Jeremiah 21:7. So we see some of the real afflictions, some of the real troubles that Israel is trying to ask God to defend us from. Now, the next few lines are going to be really interesting and we're going to talk about that in a moment. The next few lines of the Hashkivenu in our Mishkan Tefillah read differently from what was traditionally said. For us, it is distance us from wrongdoing, right? Makes sense. In the original, it invokes the name of Hasatan, Satan. The words remove Satan from in front of us and from behind us. So instead of distance us from wrongdoing, it invokes this being, whoever it is, who is a envelopment of trouble or badness, right? The Satan appears very little in our Tanakh. He appears in Job, in Chronicles. Usually it's Ha-Satan, not Satan. Ha-Satan meaning the adversary. This character can be either terrestrial or celestial. When post-biblical and rabbinic Jews further developed what we called angelology, right, the ideas of angels and hierarchies, Satan emerged more clearly as a specific individual. So we can see now that that traditional language echoes some of that aspect, that this angel or this adversary or adversary was something that we needed to guard ourselves against. Obviously, Reform Judaism, and we'll talk about the role of all that, how that language sort of developed over time, wasn't very comfortable with that, and we changed it to distance us from wrongdoing. The ideas of the shadow of your wings, shield and shelter us beneath the shadow of your wings. Really beautiful imagery. That comes from Psalm 17:8 and expresses God's care for us. Also, we ask God to watch over us, to guard over us. This comes from a paraphrase of Psalm 121. I will guard your going and coming now and forever. That's something that we do. We read at funerals sometimes. It's a powerful psalm for us. And finally, these words of Sukkat Shalom, the words of shelter of peace. The phrase is Porei Sukkah, meaning spread a shelter, and Sukkat Shalom, the shelter of peace. They're all post-biblical, but they do build on common biblical images. The sukkah we see as something functioning to protect people from perhaps the hot Mediterranean sun. We see this in our wanderings, or also in Jonah, which we talked about on Shavuot. And God offering what we call a protective sukkah. That's from Isaiah 4:6, Psalm 31:21. And Adonai porazing, I mean, if that's Hebrewish, right, representing an act of protection. And that occurs in Deuteronomy 32:11 and Ezekiel 16:8. So while the ideas of a Sukkat Shalom, a shelter of peace, are all post-biblical, its origins definitely come from our Tanakh, from our Hebrew Bible. Let's talk a little bit more about the theology that this liturgy of Hashkivenu invokes. So that first line, grant, O God, that we lie down in peace, right? Lie us down to peace. Our prayer here reflects what we would call pre-scientific belief that losing consciousness in sleep is dangerous. And I've talked about this before as to why we say the Shema before we go to bed and why we say Modeh Ani when we wake up, right? There's wonderful papers about this, about how, post-biblical but also Near Eastern ideas were that when we go to sleep, we don't know, our soul leaves us, we don't know if it's going to come back, right? We're so thrilled in the morning when our soul comes back. There's no guarantee that we'll continue living during that state and regain consciousness, right? When sleep is over. That was a real question for those living during this time. The Modeh Ani, right? It's the same reason why we thank God who Modeh Ani lefanecha, restores souls to me, right? So with that idea, we're not only in this liturgy asking that we lie down in peace, sort of literally, but we also are asking God to provide us with that peace that when we lay down, we're going to come back. So the real question is then in 2020, right? Why would adults who normally believe in both science and their own repeated experience, meaning they go to sleep and they wake up, say these words? Why would we say these words, right? An idea is that they remind us that it's a gift to sleep and then to wake up, not something to be taken for granted. A lot of the rituals that we see progressive Jews doing, even if they are pre-scientific, carry meaning to us because, God forbid we go to sleep and we don't wake up. Yeah, that's one of them. But also, how about, understanding how amazing the consciousness is, how amazing it is that our body works in that way. And being able to wake up each morning is not something to be taken for granted. It might sound a little cliche, but it's things that can keep us grounded and keep us humble. So let's talk halakha. Let's talk Jewish law in terms of our prayer here. Lie us down. Grant us, God, that we lie down in peace. The Tanaim, meaning those who taught and memorized the Talmud, left us what seems at first glance to be contrary liturgical demands. The Mishnah from 2nd century requires one blessing after the Shema in the morning, but 2 blessings in the same place at night. So if we've talked a long time ago about the rubric of the service, right? And all of this has to do with everything in terms of if you begin that structure, that rubric, starting with the Baruch Hu, right? In the morning we do Yotzer Or and Ahava Rabbah and Shema V'Ahavta Michamocha. Right? At night, which we will do tonight, we do Baruch Hu, we do Ma'ariv Aravim, Ahavat Olam, Shema V'Ahavta Michamocha. But the Talmud says that according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's necessary to connect what we call the Gitula, meaning the Michamocha, to the Tefillah, which comes right after. Tonight you will notice that we will do Michamocha, our song of redemption. That will then lead to Hashtivenu, this prayer, which then leads to Tefillah, right? Adonai Sifatai Tiftach. In the morning, you will notice that we go through it with Michamocha, but from Michamocha, it goes directly into the Tefillah. So the rabbis of the Talmud said you need something to connect it, okay? There's a reason then, at night, that the Amidah doesn't come directly after that, right? Another rabbinic scholar, the Tur, explains that the Hashtivenu should be thought of an intensification, an elaboration of the Michamocha, of the redemption, the Geulah, right? The theme of it is that we're rescued, there's salvation, and so we move forward with that, with Hashtivenu, which emphasizes those things, right? But a redemption through peace and safety. Joseph Carroll, later 16th century, argues that the Hashtivenu reflects the fears of the Israelites when they too would be engulfed in the Red Sea's waters. So Hashtivenu counts formally as a separate blessing, as for the Mishnah, but it constitutes no interruption of the Geulah, which connects to the Amidah. So let me put that back together with you, right? In the eyes of the rabbis, the Michamocha needs to connect directly to the Amidah, right? one might think that the Hashkivenu gets in the way. So the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah says one thing, the Talmud says another. So instead of saying, hey, it's an interruption, they're saying, no, this is actually part of Geulah. It's actually part of redemption of Micha Mocha, and that will lead us to Tefillah. So tonight you'll see that we'll go Micha Mocha Hashkivenu Tefillah. And that's meant simply to elucidate and intensify. Okay? A little bit of history for you on this prayer of Hashkivenu. There are some changes that occur if you are doing Hashkivenu on a weekly Ma'ariv and a Shabbat Ma'ariv. The Shabbat conclusion changes. It reiterates the thought of our desire for a shelter of peace. The Jerusalem Talmud implies that it was said every day. This was in the 3rd or 4th centuries, and possibly later. That was the normal. That's how early this is, 3rd or 4th century, at least in Eretz Yisrael, right? The version without the shelter of peace, meaning without that chatima, haporei sukat shalom. In the 16th century, it was the name of a mystical fellowship founded by Elazar Azakiri, right? The author of Yedid Nefesh. This idea of sukat shalom. It's a great little phrase. It's one we like to use. It's used a lot. And it spawned prayers for victims of abuse, who we pray will feel protection for divine shelter of peace. For us, it's used as an image for those who are in war conditions, those who are feeling oppressed by mental and emotional and spiritual difficulties. So there's a lot that can be taken out of this liturgical view of Haporei Sukat Shalom, spread over a shelter of peace. So that has been, throughout the centuries, really expanded upon and probably helped with that aspects of the prayer's popularity. So to end this discussion here, I want to go back to that issue of Hasatan, of the fact that Satan makes it into the traditional version of this prayer. It's very strange and probably jarring to many of us. It was to me. Obviously, the mention of Satan troubled many of the Reform authors. Abraham Geiger, in his prayer book, as well as the Gates of Prayer, retain the line. So if you go back and you look at your old Gates of Blue, Gates of Prayer, it's in there. My guess is we didn't say it much. I don't remember saying it when I was growing up with Gates of Blue. Isaac Mayer Wise, in his prayer book, as well as the Union prayer book, got rid of it immediately. They just omitted it. So if you grew up with the 1946 or 1957 Union prayer book, you wouldn't have seen it. Interesting, Israeli Reform and British Liberal prayer books, they substitute the phrase, which was, guard us from Satan, as distance sin and iniquity from us, right? And I think we were inspired by that, our editors of Mishkan Tefillah, when we said distance us from wrongdoing instead. The conservative prayer book, Sim Shalom, retains the Hebrew, which mentions Satan, but it renders in English, remove the evil forces that surround us. So you can see that for the most part, even into conservative and Israeli and British and American Reform and Canadian Reform, we're not very comfortable mentioning Satan. It's a weird character. It's a weird thing to put in there. And so it really is distracting and takes away from what we think to be the beautiful meaning of this prayer. So we've got a few minutes to answer some questions. For those who have joined us now, we're talking about the Hashkivenu prayer, which is on page 160, or Mishkan Tefillah for Travelers on page 38. Grant, O God, that we lie down in peace and raise us up, our guardian to life renewed. So if there are any questions, please feel to type them in. I'll also mention that it's one of my favorite prayers. The history part that I didn't mention was that, while certainly 16th, 17th, 18th century and onward, it was a prayer that not only connected us from Geulah to Amidah, but also was a prayer to guard us as we were walking home, right? We would end Ma'ariv evening prayers throughout the week. And so this was a prayer to retain with us that we are going to be safe on our way home. Since then, I'm proud to know that it has been really expanded in terms of its meaning, really beautiful meanings. As we read about, it's a prayer that is used for those who are victims of abuse, domestic abuse, and that sort of thing. It's a prayer that we can expand and hope for those who are ill, those who are, as we said, in warlike conditions. There's many understandings of peace, of shalom. And so I think that it's a wonderful thing that we can pull it apart and interpret Hashkivenu to fit the needs of the world. And that as the world needs something else, or as our individuals need something else, the meaning of the prayer changes a little bit. And I think we can say that about all our prayers. This year, when we say one particular prayer, boy, that hits us in a certain way. Whereas last year, maybe it didn't. With the things that are going on in the world, certain prayers retain a great deal more meaning for us, whereas the year before it didn't, and next year it might mean something else completely. So really a nice understanding through the lens of Hashkivenu on the elasticity of the interpretation of our liturgy. I love that about our Mishkan Tefillah, that we can experience those things, that you can feel a personal connection to that prayer. You or someone you know, or situations going on in the world. Whereas the person next to you might be thinking something different. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's exactly the reason for prayer. And so I think that's really important. So with that, friends, if there are any questions about